I'm assuming that you've all found today very interesting. I've certainly found it incredibly interesting with the variety of different speakers that we've had talking about a whole range of different areas on big data. I think it rounded off very nicely with Kepeng a few minutes ago. So, first thing I'm going to do is ask if there are any questions from the floor about the whole day. Okay, I'll kick it off then. So, just coming back on sort of the presentation just from Kepeng. So, talking about the network API, and I was trying to think of just an example where a third party wants to get some information out of an operator. So we heard earlier from Francesco about the idea that you can publish CDRs and you can analyse them. But so I was thinking of this situation at Heathrow Airport in the UK, and they're thinking to themselves, I'd like to know how many people forget to switch off their mobile phones when they take off from Heathrow Airport. Okay, which is a reasonable thing that they might actually want to find out. Now, I'm presuming at the moment that if they called Orange, or Everything Everywhere, or whatever it's called these days, or any of the other operators in the UK, they might actually find it quite a difficult job to get that type of information from those operators. So the question is the process for getting that broken just because operators don't want to give out that data, or is there actually a big data problem because the operators just don't know how to provide that data to a third party? Because, it's either a very manual process, it's a very specific thing, you want to find out who's doing a location update between particular location areas as they fly out on the standard flight paths out of Heathrow. But it's not rocket science, really. So the question is what could you do within standards to actually make that happen?
So, in my opinion, for the standard interface, we can only define some simple interface to expose some basic data. So we can define some data models and data elements, data attributes, and then we can define API, a simple API to expose to the third parties. And then how to handle the data, how to use the data will be determined by the third party. So for the standard interface, it will not solve the specific problem. It just solve the interoperability problem. So I think that kind of example should be left to the third party to handle that.
So the third party interrogates, finds the information that they want, and then they do their own processing of it.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else want to give a view on that?
I think one of the things we do at the lab is people come to us with problems, and then we have to try and work out what's the right way to solve this. And I think the first question is, what are the questions that people are asking? Because now we have all this data and we have a way to crunch through it, that's great. But people like you need to come to us and say, we want to ask you this difficult question about your data. And so we can try and work out, well, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Is it appropriate to use big data for it? And then once we found that, yes, this is a real business need, that's when we can start saying, okay, here is how we might do it the first time, and then here is how we need to get standards bodies to help us do this so that we're all on the same page, we're all reporting the same data. But first of all, please, if you need to start asking these questions to operators and to vendors so they know what they need to look for in the data.
So in other words, if nobody asks, everyone knows that there's lots of big data, but if nobody asks some specific questions, then you're never quite sure how to provide it in a standardized way.
Exactly.
Okay. Brian?
A question related to big data. I think the last presentation that Kepeng provided related to the privacy topics on the first panel, etc. What do you think should be the standardization opportunity, for example, in defining, let's say, data about the data? In other words, where it came from, what its provenance was, what the nature of the sensitivity of the data, what are the terms under which it could be used, et cetera. What do you think about the opportunities for definition of those types of metadata?
All right, let me give a stab at and a point of view on this one. So to put it in context, when I was running the MMA, every quarter I had to get in front of the FTC and testify why we didn't need to be regulated. So protecting this and coming up with reasonable rules around it is something I still have scars over. So taking on this kind of challenge when you've got different constituencies that have different levels of access to it is particularly problematic, especially when some of them don't want it known that they have special access to it. So for example, metadata that says, here's where I got that information from might not seem particularly relevant unless it's got some security implication associated with it. So who has access to what level of metadata becomes a country by country and jurisdiction by jurisdiction kind of problem. So it doesn't exactly lend itself for an easy answer. But coming up with a fine line, for example, like PII data, what constitutes it, that there's a line that's much more easily drawn, and that's a hard enough one to draw. But when you talk about the data, that becomes direct, it also becomes derived, and it also becomes the unintended consequence of integration. Right? So when you commingle multiple data sources, you actually end up with more data than you originally had, and there's different privacy rules that govern each of them. So it becomes a somewhat intractable problem when you start thinking about, when we do something like say, sure, I'd love to do Facebook Connect. Right? What does that actually mean to the privacy components of what I've now said I want to link together? So it's thorny, it's a classic industry problem, but I think that it's somewhat of a boil the ocean problem still.
You wouldn't expect somebody in B2B to answer that question, but the time we've touched it, to give a practical example, is that we move from, remember I mentioned this GTIN, which is unique for that product. We're moving now to serialized GTINs, which mean that product would be different, that entity would be different from this entity. The biggest area we're seeing this in is obviously the carrier's RFID, but that's immaterial, is in apparel. And there is a US store, Walmart, who for all of their denim jeans use an RFID tag applied at source. There's a German seller of clothing who gets all of their clothes tagged at source with a unique serial number. That means if you bought the same shirt as me, your shirt will be different from my shirt. Massive supply chain advantages there. If you've ever seen anybody trying to stock take, for example, with swing tickets on the end of things, especially in ladies' fashion, they're on their hands and knees gathering the data. With a wand, you just walk around. The other one is for security. If you go out through the gate, instead of having a big plastic tag on, I can read the serial number, interrogate the post terminal, say that's never been bought, and set off the... The problem is, picking up on your point, the EU regulation around that and the US regulation around that are completely different. One has to cut the tag out. The other will allow you to destroy the tag electronically. In other words, to write the tag at the point of sale. Now that makes it very difficult in the supply chain, so it's a bit of an answer to your question, is because often now in clothing it's being put on the inside. If you're going to have an RFID tag, why would you bother having it on a swing ticket? It just seems ridiculous. If it's made at manufacture, you could put it on the lapel. And if you cut the lapel off your suit as you leave the store, I think you might have a bit of a problem. So I think it's a practical example of the issues you will have around these two privacies. And by the way, take that one, who really thinks anybody's going to stand in the street with a handheld scanner to find out, that you bought that particular thing? They could do it easier with your mobile phone to track you than your suit. But
wouldn't marketers be interested in whether you were dressed in Prada or Primark?
sorry?
Wouldn't a marketer be interested in whether you were dressed in Prada or Primark?
Yes, I can see the point, but you'd have to have RFID scanners on every street corner.
And there's mine. And marketers would.
But this is what we come up against just with the idea of just identifying products. Sorry.
From a more technical point of view, I'd love to see a situation where we had databases that had a concept of version and data source kind of built into them. And if all the underlying databases we use, and there's not actually that many of them, kind of upgraded to have that built in, then the whole thing would be a lot easier, and we wouldn't have to keep coming up with bespoke solutions and ourselves. But we all have them.
Mike had a point to you. I was talking to Mike earlier, and there was a question that wasn't quite answered, so I'll just hand over to Mike to
Yeah, thanks.
finish that one.
It was a comment that was made about brand verified accurate data and how that's going to get responded to a customer. And it is a very significant problem, right? I mean, because it's to the point that you made. If you don't have somewhere to go to get the data, then it's best efforts of anybody can say anything they want and report it. But there's also another challenge to it. And the challenge is that some of it you want brand accurate data, but some of it you may want the service provider to be adding value. You know, for example, I've got 70-something data sources that I pay every month to in order to get accurate product testing information, to get additional review information and things like that. That isn't something that the brand should have the ability to go in and say, well, wait a minute, I like those reviews, I don't like these reviews, right? I mean, the person is using the application or using the service for the purpose of trying to make a buying decision. We want to represent accurately what that means. So there's also this issue of brand accurate data, and then there's other data that differentiates one service provider or shop savvy from anybody else who's doing those kinds of things. So I did want to just call out the distinction that there is going to be somewhat of a split kind of response that could come out, and therefore, how do you maintain that the end user knows this stuff is absolutely guaranteed accurate, you can hold them accountable for it, and the rest of this is just someone else's opinion?
And I'll be honest, we're struggling with this. There's two things you mentioned there. One is there has to be some sort of identifiable seal. I won't get into great detail whether it's electronic, how it's displayed. There has to be some seal, because as a consumer, if I don't differentiate that this was provided by brand or this was crowdsourced, why do I care? Why have I gone to all that bother? The second thing is, I'll be very honest with you, the brands are not as forward-thinking as everyone in this room, and so they believe if they give the data, then they have a right to say who will use it and what they will use it for. My standard reply, and I'll do this in open forum because they know my views, is, the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in again. You won't stop app developers doing things. Would you rather they did the things with at least the facts being the correct facts, or would you rather just let them get on with it? And that's been my challenge. And we are discussing.
I completely agree with you, and I think that if it does get clamped down on that hard, then the existing way of doing it is going to be the continued way to do it, which is best efforts, which is, oh great, I got the UPC code, I'm going to go to Google and I'm going to look it up and do the best I can.
So on that point, I think there also needs to be, brands need to see the value in providing this information. So as an example, I'm a vegetarian, and still, I find foods in the supermarket which should be vegetarian, but it doesn't have that little symbol on there. And so I have to use a third-party scanner and scan it, and I found something crowdsourced, which I hope is accurate, but I don't know. But there are lots of brands which just need that. They need to see that people are crowdsourcing, it may not be accurate, and that hopefully will give them the push that, we need to provide all this data because there are gaps in the market like that.
You obviously read my pitch to them, because that's exactly what I say every time.
I was going to ask one question of Alan. Where's Alan gone? You can answer from there, or maybe from up here. It was really related to scanners on phones. So if you look at the moment, you can download any number of different scanners onto different devices, smartphone devices. But if you looked at sort of 5 years hence, what proportion of the low-end phones, the sort of €15 type feature phones at that time, will have built-in QR code readers, do you think?
So look at the history of this, perhaps indirectly answering this. Look at the feature phones that have been supporting scanners for a long time now, it's over 10, 12 years. So if the slowest phone will follow the same requirement as existing feature phone, they should support it, and they will be able to support it. For the feature phone, we could integrate it into the camera apps, So you don't have to have dedicated apps on this thing. And the requirement for the 2D barcode is barely minimal these days. So I imagine a lot of the code, a lot of the phones will be able to support it in place. So there's no reason to, or any phone coming up today would not be able to support a barcode.
But do you think they will?
I think it's a case by case. If you integrate it into the camera itself, then it becomes much easier, it becomes much natural. You don't have to download an application. In some cases, you don't have the ability to download, and when you download an application, now you got to find which one, and that's a problem. And going forward, with the ability to have, perhaps not directly to your question, but with these phones, the 2D barcode, and particularly when we see QR code now is dominating, particularly in North America, you cannot tell this QR code belong to something I generated for free, something that Mike and his company will generate, or a GS1 barcode. So we already experienced that in the trial. I go read a code and it freezes. So I don't know if it doesn't know how to read it. So I don't know if it's a problem belonging to the code, was mismanaged, or the phone, or the application. And generally after 2 trial, people turn it off and they think all the barcode are the same. So with this thing, what OMA is trying to do with this going forward, is to have this what we call universal scanner, for lack of a better word, in place. We have a marker of what OMA code look like. And we have a marker for GS1, which they marked and identified. And we have marker for the others. And this application is smart enough to tell you, oh, that's direct or indirect. There's something you generate, you don't need internet, then I could process it for you and display it in place. And that's a GS1 code. Then we know it's a product code in place. Then the application be smart enough, and if there's any value added, either crowdsource or going out, to augment it as possible.
So just a couple of thoughts, because in general, I agree with you, Alan, on most of that. The challenge, or the data that I can give back is, we were a large supplier to embedded phones that didn't have open OSs. There is insufficient money operators and handset providers are willing to spend in order for anybody to be in that business. So you're not going to do a customized scanner application to sell it on a $15 phone, because they're going to say, well, that costs more than a transistor, so we're not putting it on the phone. So it's just an uneconomic thing. So the model that we adopted was one of, well, there's certain things that phone absolutely has to do no matter what, one of which it needs to be able to send pictures. So we said, all right, so suppose we could just create a widget kind of service that can take an image, and literally take a picture of the QR code, send it to a known server, get it resolved on the server, and send it back. So in effect, it's really nothing more than using the MMS transport via an icon. And that's the way that we've solved it for a lot of the lower-end phones, and it just avoided all of the native code development on devices that just can't bear the cost. The other thing is, I just want to copy and amplify the whole idea of an end user being able to visually recognize that this is a good code versus a bad code. This group, I would love to have some way that we could help solve that problem. That's a huge one.
And we recognize as a problem, it's causing us, some of our phones, it's causing problem when they roam outside, because there are a few markers that missed and they haven't tested for them. And particularly if GS1 comes up with a lot of markers, we're able to read that's a GS1 instead. So we have a role to play to actually identify at least the one that's willing to come and tell us their spec and say, this is my spec, we could look for it and identify it.
So kind of just as an input to the product planning for Kenny and crew, that would be an awesome requirement.
Actually, I could quickly add to that. I think that the URS shortener is a hidden challenge. Because
Terrence mentioned it's a great tool for phishing. We want to discourage and prevent, at least find a workaround that, so that is not a good practice.
Sorry, can I just... So I'm not trying to sell GS1 here, but we don't just provide the barcode, we provide a lot of information about how you produce the barcode. I've heard a few things, and I saw Terry's examples of badly produced QR codes. If you think about it, the standard 1D code is scanned 5 billion times a day at checkout in the world. 5 billion scans a day. You can imagine we're not allowed, or our industry has said, you couldn't have 1% that don't read. I mean, we've got it down to 0.000001 because we're very particular about specifying how you produce it. We don't own the generic QR code, but I would have thought someone, yourselves, us, I don't know, someone should take some responsibility about the rules. Can you print it in, almost black and black, and what's the contrast ratio has got to be? Does it have to be square? All these kind of things that should be specified.
And I think we actually do have, old OMA had, there are best practices on our website. You can download them. The issue is enforcement.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, through the brands, that's how we enforce it, because the retailers would fine them if they got it wrong. So that's maybe a route to get it, that the brands buy into this, and their marketing departments buy into it when they put a QR code on. I don't know. It's a thought.
So, any last questions from the floor?
Quick response. Always have. We attempted to answer that question. We attempted to answer that problem in place. So we have best practice that we capture in the index. I think it's about 15 or 20 pages. It goes down to the size, the recommendation, the quality of the printer, the DPI, and even the Luminex on the papers. So we have a good guideline. Of course, we can always go back and update it and see if there's anything new onto that.
The difference is, to be frank, without being nasty, you have to make it a global standard. You have to get the buy-in of the people who are going to put it on to say, we accept this is the way we'll do it, and we will implement it. That solves the problem. You can do the standards, but you've got to get buy-in from industry to say, we now agree that we will abide by this.
Okay, we're coming to the end here, so I'm going to go through all the panellists, and based upon today, what would their advice be to the audience as to what they should take away from today and what they should be doing tomorrow to take forward the OMA work on big data? Kepeng. What should the people here do going away from today's meeting? Seminar.
Maybe we can organize a future conference call or meeting, follow-up meeting to collect the ideas, and then maybe we can think about to initiate a work item or a white paper for that.
Thanks.
Very simple. I think we should be closer together. I think we should work together. You represent the consumer end, we represent the supplier and retailer end, and I think we should think about things, whether we have joint plenaries together, whether we have joint events where we're doing standards development, etc. So my challenge would be, how can we work closer together?
Great. James.
For me, it really crystallised this morning, and it's really the mobile network operators working together very quickly, so don't have other conferences about it, get doing it, to put people's data in one place, this digital vault concept, or the vendor relationship management, as it sort of was referred to, get on and implement it, because if you don't, someone else will, and they'll enjoy more success with it, and it would be another thing that could have been lost. And I think it will really help move it on.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. There are actually vendors in the mobile space who are already selling their solutions into the mobile operators on that basis. So it's kind of started, but I think the takeaway for me would be that OMA should think how it can support user-controlled personal data ecosystems with the sorts of standardization that might improve the generic trust of such an ecosystem.
Thanks, Mark. Philip.
It's an interesting one for me because this is my first experience of OMA. And I'm split between that old battle between bellhead and nethead, and I think those differences are blending away somewhat. But for example, when I see some of the wonders of the web manifest, such as the facility for someone to have the idea of a QR code and then for it to
just go out into the world without some kind of official stamp of approval. And I kind of like celebrate that. That feels good to me. And when I hear GS1 saying, actually we want to take control of it and lock it down and improve it and standardize it, that seems, with all due respect, slightly counterintuitive and not playing to the strengths of the 7 billion people on this planet. So I would say, in terms of the OMA's approach to everything to do with big data, think about the human, think about you as a human first, as opposed to possibly entrenched motivations to do with your organisation and their shareholders. Because if we think about the human first, everyone benefits in the longer term.
Excellent. Terence?
I would say keep asking awkward questions. And the two most awkward questions you can ask are, one, is this good for customers? As you say, not is it good for me, is it good for my business, but is this good for people? And then the second one is, why doesn't this do X? And it might be, why doesn't GS1 contain vegetarian information? Why doesn't big data tell me whether people are taking, not switching their phones off? Why doesn't this happen? And don't sort of accept, well, that's just the way it works as an answer. If there's information that you need to get out, just keep badgering away until you get it.
Well, I have, I don't know if the enviable or unenviable position of following 8 really smart people who had something to say. I really have 2 closing comments on that one. I'd say number 1, act responsibly with what we're collecting. I mean, the data that we're able to get, if we use it for unintended consequences or for something that could be perceived optically even as bad, we will lose this opportunity. The regulatory community will come down on us, our customers will come down on us. So I think we have to be very, very careful about how we use the data that we're collecting, and it's one of the paramount things that goes through my mind every time someone says there's another variable I can capture. Do I really want to? The other thing is, and I hate to be on the other side of this one, but I'm kind of right in the middle. If it's good for the world, that's fantastic. But if it destroys GDP in doing it, then poverty ensues and badness happens and things like that. So although I get why we want to give better information to customers, it actually costs money to give that better information to customers. And we need to have some kind of revenue vehicle that makes it possible for us to do that, or else this room continues to get smaller. And I really don't want to see that happen because it slows down innovation over time. So I'd caution against the idea of just do it because it's good for the world if it's truly bad for everything that's necessary to support it going forward.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So I'd like you to all, share with me your appreciation for all of the speakers today. I think we've had some great presentations, so